Well, good morning. As I mentioned last week, we are transitioning now to a new series. And we're going to go from the New Testament into the Old Testament. And turn with me to Genesis chapter 37. We're going to read a large portion of the chapter of 37 because the story in 37 is very critical for us in the series that I wanted to do in the coming months. We're going to read from verses 1 through 11 and then verses 18 through 20. So Jacob settled again in the land of Canaan, where his father had lived as a foreigner. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. One night, Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly, my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. His brothers responded, so you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. Verse 9, soon Joseph had another dream. And again he told his brothers about it. Listen, I have had another dream, he said. The sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed low before me. This time he told the dream to his father as well as to his brothers. But his father scolded him. What kind of dream is that? He asked. Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? But while his brothers were jealous of Joseph, his father wondered what the dreams meant. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, verse 18, they recognized him in the distance. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on and let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams, and we'll stop there. Today we are going to start a new series, a series that I am calling Journey Out of Egypt. And we want to study how the Israelites, if you look at the history, we all know about Exodus. How did they even get to Egypt? Right? So we want to study how they got to Egypt. And chapter 37 is kind of the beginning of the journey of the Israelites to Egypt. How they got to Egypt, what did they do in Egypt, what kind of things happened to them, and ultimately looking at the Exodus, the journey out of Egypt. Throughout our study, it will be clear that God orchestrated the events in the characters' lives to accomplish his ultimate purpose. As we look at the story today, and as we look at the events that unfold in the coming weeks, one of the things I really want us to understand is that God orchestrated each and every single one of those events so that in the greater picture, greater purpose of his plan could be realized. It doesn't mean that, as we will see, it doesn't mean that these characters didn't suffer. Just because God orchestrated every event in their life doesn't mean that they were free from suffering, that they didn't have any hardships. In fact, it was through these trials, through these hardships, that God still worked his purpose. So we keep in mind that when we face trials, and when things happen in our own lives that may not make sense at the moment, but when we think about it in the grand scheme of God's plan, or God's purpose, we see these events that God uses, or these circumstances that he uses to bring about his plans, to accomplish his purpose. And we don't have to really look long and hard about our own journey. How you got to even sitting in these seats. It's the way that God moves in your lives, the people that he puts. Sometimes it's struggles and trials. Sometimes it's great things. But all of these things that happen are a part of his ultimate purpose for each one of us. So the big truth or the big statement to remember as we go through this series is God is behind everything. God is behind everything. When we look at it, this story of Joseph with this statement in mind, it helps us to absorb some of the challenges that he goes through. But it also can make us uneasy. Because if God is behind everything, we'll see that even some of the things that caused Joseph and his brother's relationship to deteriorate, God allowed that to happen. So those are some of the things that we have to wrestle with as we look at this story. How did they get to Egypt? So this, chapter 37 of Genesis kind of gets us there. As we know the story, Joseph is sold by his brothers, right? And when you look at verse 26 and 27 of chapter 37, Judah, who is one of the oldest, says, "What will we gain by killing our brother?" Actually, they wanted to kill him. We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. Can you see the sarcasm in his voice, even in the writing? And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were the Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him up out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took him to Egypt. How did Joseph end up in Egypt? He was sold by his brothers. 20 pieces of silver. I don't know what the equivalency of that is today, but still probably not enough if you think about life. And you know, when you look at the story, if you have a brother or a sister, you know sometimes things are not always great. They're not always smooth sailing. And there's been times when you've wanted to maybe physically hurt your sibling. But have you ever entertained the thought or the idea, I want to sell him or her? Usually not. But this is what's going on here. Joseph is sold for 20 pieces of silver by his brothers. We have to understand the family dynamic here, because I think that really helps us to see. In some ways, this was a dysfunctional family. But we have to understand the family dynamic. What caused his brothers to have so much anger and hatred towards Joseph that they would do such a horrible thing of selling him? In chapter 37, I think there are about at least 3 things that happen that I think continues to build upon this narrative that Joseph's brothers do not like him. The first incident we see is found in verse 2. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. Of the several things that we see, Joseph's report about his brothers leads to trouble. Verse 2. What were they doing? We don't know. No one knows what his brothers were doing. But we know that they were doing something that most likely they knew their father would not approve of. Maybe they were slacking off. If these were shepherds, so they're out there, taking care of the sheep. Oftentimes they're gone for a long period of time to help to find pasture for the sheep, food for the sheep. They're out wandering around. And as they're wandering and as they're herding the sheep, maybe they were doing some bad things. And Joseph saw that. So he came back and he gave a report to his father. Hey Dad. Hey, Joseph, how are the brothers doing? Oh, well, you see, that's what's going on. There's some debate about, Joseph a little bit here. Was he out there looking for heirs to point to his father? Some people feel like, Joseph was kind of like tattletale. Dad, oh, you're not going to believe what I saw Judah doing today. Or something like that. But whatever the report contained, whatever these bad things that they were doing, when Joseph came back and told his dad and gave a report of what his brothers were doing, what we are told is that his brothers, they hated him because of those bad reports. I don't know if Jacob sent out Joseph to go kind of check up on his brothers because he knew those guys, every time I send them out, they get into trouble. Joseph, I trust you. I trust that you will not fool around. I want you to go and keep an eye. Was that the case? We don't know. But whatever this report contained, his brothers did not like it. It caused them to hate him. The second incident that we see is found in the very next verses. Joseph's relationship with his father leads to trouble. Verse 3, Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children. All you have to do is read and stop there. Favoritism. It's understandable that Joseph would like, one of his sons maybe a little bit more. But the degree of favoritism from Jacob to Joseph, or Jacob towards Joseph, was very significant. We're told one of the reasons is because Joseph had been born to Jacob in his old age. So one day Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. We stop there once again and we're thinking, wow, not only are we told that Joseph is the most loved, but he has the special robe, a beautiful robe that is specially made for him. I remember looking at some of those picture Bibles when I was younger. And in this story, Joseph gets this coat. This long sleeve coat is like stripes and it's colorful. And all his other brothers are standing around in like just old, plain, like bland color. There was a major contrast. A beautiful robe was created, was knitted together, just given to Joseph, not to his other brothers, but just to Joseph. In verse 4, what do we read? His brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. The sign of affection from Jacob to Joseph was this special robe. This robe was different than his brothers. Okay, the term we see is a beautiful robe. And no one knows what this robe looked like. The picture Bibles, they kind of paint one possibility. But when you look down throughout history and look at some of the garments of this era, scholars begin to paint a picture of the contrast between Jacob's robe and that worn by his brothers. Most of the time, the robes were worn, as an extra layer. They were usually short sleeve, came down to the knees, and very plain, a solid color. That was very typical. So the contrast that we see between his brothers and Jacob's robe, most scholars believe that it probably was long sleeve, came all the way down to the ankles, and it was colorful. And there's a significance of that understanding. As one of the commentaries says, that Joseph's coat was a symbol of authority he was granted over his brothers. In this act of affection and this act of love from Jacob to Joseph by presenting Joseph this particular robe. Many scholars believe that this was almost a symbol of not just Jacob's preference over Joseph, but his position over his brothers. The coat his father gave him was regarded as evidence of Jacob's greater love for Joseph above his other sons. And also, this coat indicated more than preference. It symbolized preeminence and superiority of rank. Why did they believe this? Because the word that is used here for this robe, beautiful robe, it's only used one other time in the Bible. 2 Samuel 13, 18 through 19. There, it's used to describe the robe that is worn by Tamar, daughter of David, which would signify royalty. So the usage of the word is a very rare word, plus setting the contrast between his brothers and then the response of his brothers towards that gift. Joseph's own behavior in some sense leads to many to believe that this was something that Joseph received that would have pretty much symbolized his authority over his brothers. Joseph's brothers, they hated this garment because of what it symbolized. If this was a symbol of authority of Joseph over them, he being one of the youngest, right? Having authority over the rest of his brothers, they hated that robe. Because when Joseph comes and they seize him, the very first act of violence that they do against Joseph is they strip the robe off of him. Which is why scholars have this understanding, or they believe, that it symbolized his preeminent authority over them, or superiority of rank. Chapter 37, verse 23, we read, they seized him, they took or they stripped the robe off of him. This is where I said, when we think about God is behind everything, then we come to this passage of verse 3. Jacob loves Joseph more than any of his other sons. It's like, why? What did Jacob do? Jacob really didn't do anything, I don't think, to really warrant that favor and favoritism from his father, except for the fact that he was one of the last ones born. But for that particular purpose, just because he received the favoritism, and I'm pretty sure Joseph liked it, it causes his brothers to hate him. God is behind everything. How do we wrestle with it? How do we unpack this? That God is behind Joseph or Jacob's favoritism towards Joseph, which causes an animosity and a broken relationship with his brothers, which ultimately causes him to be sold and end up in Egypt so that through that he can rescue them? We have to understand God is behind everything. Everything that you and I have experienced up to this point, positive and negative, God is behind it. And he's using those things and those events and those things that occur in our lives to accomplish a greater purpose than you and I sometimes are able to see. Joseph's brothers, they hated him. They hated this garment. And they wanted to kill him. The coat, not only the report, bad report, but the coat further isolates Joseph from his brothers. The third incident of chapter 37, Joseph's dreams lead to trouble. Perhaps we'll put them over the top, were these dreams that Joseph had. Look at verse 5. Joseph has two dreams. First dream he is out in the field with his brothers. They're tying up bundles of grain. Okay? They're out there, they're cutting grain, and they're tying them up. And he says, suddenly, verse 7, my bundles stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. Okay, that was his first dream. Second dream. Soon, verse 9, Joseph had another dream. And again he told his brothers, listen, I have had another dream, he said. The sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed low before me. Sun representing probably his father, moon his mother, 11 stars were his brothers, bowed low before me. What happens when he shares his dreams with his brothers? Verse 8, his brothers respond, do you actually think you will reign over us? Do you think you will be our king? And we read this word again, and they hated him. They hated him. Verse 10, he told his father, and his father says, what kind of dream is this? A little shocked. But to himself, he reflects, what could this dream possibly mean? You know, was it Joseph's fault that he had these dreams? No. These dreams were given to him by God. So once again, a dream that is given to him by God, that he shares with his brothers, causes this animosity and hatred by his brothers towards him, which leads him to be sold off. God is behind everything. It was given to Joseph about future events that would happen. But it was also on Joseph, I think, to remain humble. That is not the picture that we get to, is it? Verse 8, they hated him because of the dreams and the way he talked about them. I don't know, that to me, when I read that, I kind of get this idea that he's like, kind of maybe walked around with his chest out a little bit. He's like, you guys remember that dream I told you about? Yeah. I don't know, I just get the sense that the way Joseph talked about everything, he just did not approach it in a very humble way. That it was boastful. You guys will bow down to me. That's the kind of dream I had. That's the kind of the picture that we get. You could even make an argument that Joseph probably didn't need to share his dream with his brothers or with his family. What was there to be gained by sharing the dream with them? If I had a dream like that, I would be like, oh, what does that mean? I think I would be very cautious who I share those kinds of dreams with. I think Joseph demonstrated his immaturity. And the way he shared about those dreams, I think showed a boastful spirit. You know, all of these factors played a significant role in Joseph's deteriorating relationship with his brothers. The bad report, favoritism, these dreams. Isn't there another way that God could have gotten Joseph to Egypt? Maybe study abroad or something? Isn't there another way besides this? It's very interesting I read through these chapters and in Genesis quite a bit this past week, and I'm reading the story, and I'm just like, oh, even what happens before this, and from here all the way up into Exodus, it's like, wow. We have the benefit of hindsight. But one of the things that I continue to, am still some ways trying to understand is the depths of which God went to cause them to get to Egypt. In his path was broken relationships. In his path was just A lot of things that you wonder, isn't there another way? Joseph's brothers hated him. And their first thought was to kill him. So their brothers are out in the field, and Joseph is told by Jacob, hey, I want you to go to your brothers. So Joseph goes to where they're supposed to be, but they're not there. And he asks somebody, and they're like, oh yeah, your brothers, they actually moved on over that way. So Joseph goes to find them, and he finds them. They recognize him from a distance. In verse 19, they say, here comes the dreamer. That's what they called him. Here comes the dreamer. Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. See, they're saying, we kill him. We'll see if those dreams ever come to fruition. The dreams about them bowing down to him. This was how Joseph ended up in Egypt. At the very end of chapter 37, verse 36, we're told that the Midianites, the Ishmaelites, they sold him as a slave to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Potiphar was the captain of the palace guard. Of all the places that Joseph could have ended up, he ended up in this place. And this is no accident either. For as much as chapter 37, we just looked at all of the maybe perhaps negative things happen, and how ultimately it led to him being sold. Him ending up in Potiphar's house would be the beginning of the restoration, which we will look at in the coming weeks. So Joseph begins his life in Egypt as a slave. Once again, when we look at the characters throughout this story, Joseph is thinking, my life is ruined. What hope do I have? My brothers have sold me, and now I am a slave. You can understand if he has animosity towards his brothers, God, when all of this is going on, for him to feel like, I am absolutely alone. But we will see next week that God uses this to bring about a tremendous amount of blessing and favor. That God is not forgotten here by Joseph. And that's one of the attributes I would love for us to really maintain and keep an eye on throughout the story. Joseph's relationship with God, it only grows stronger from this point on.